The theme of this annual conference, diversifying away from the over-reliance on minerals, not just oil, but on all kinds of minerals, unprocessed commodities, and exporting them to countries of the north. And this is not just a challenge for Nigeria, it's a challenge for many countries on the continent. What is even more urgent, and this found expression in the presentation that the Group MD made, what is even more urgent is the need for us to boost intra-Africa trade. And in boosting intra-Africa trade, to completely dismantle the colonial economic model that existed for the last 60 to 70 years, which keeps us trapped and remaining in this over-reliance on Europe or another part of the world for trading in unprocessed commodities. So the theme today is entirely consistent with the objectives of the AfCFTA. And so whilst here in Nigeria it appears that there is a dependence of oil as an export revenue, export earnings of over 80%, remaining a crucial government revenue, constituting about 40% of total revenue of government. However, oil accounted for only 6.5% on average in the last 2 years. Again, as was pointed out in the presentation earlier, this is a challenge that this event must continue to confront. Indeed, as difficult as the task may be, economic diversification must continue to be Africa's objective, to reduce natural resources accounting for the greatest share of export earnings and government revenue. As I mentioned earlier, this is a challenge not only for Nigeria. According to a United Nations Conference Trade and Development report, commodities account for more than 60% of total merchandise exports in 45 out of 54 African countries. Africa is home only to 8 of the world's 15 least economically diversified countries. And if you consider the fact that 55 countries in Africa, as we speak, contribute today only 3.1% to global GDP and contribute only 2.2% to global trade and output. And yet a country such as Singapore contributes over 6% to global trade and output. That must underscore 2 points in my view. First, that this deficit is an opportunity for Africa to accelerate industrial development, accelerate our competitiveness, and to create jobs. The second point it drives home is that the African continent, not a single country in Africa, shall be able to be globally competitive if it stands on its own. And therefore, the market integration objective of the AfCFTA, which, by the way, as we all know, is legally anchored on the Abuja Treaty, is certainly an avenue for Africa to explore to accelerate economic diversification, competitiveness, not only regionally, but globally. As we heard earlier, the lack of economic diversification often results in increased vulnerability to external shocks, and these vulnerabilities undermine prospects for longer-term economic growth. And here there are two events that, again, I wish to join those who spoke before me to underscore: the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the current geopolitical context between Russia and Ukraine. Inflationary pressures. Up to 35% inflationary pressures on food prices in Africa as a result of the current political context, geopolitical context, geoeconomic context that has absolutely nothing to do with the African continent, and yet has produced a materially adverse impact on food security in Africa. President Kagame reminded us the other day that a country of 44 million people, or 43 million people in Europe, is feeding a continent of 1.3 billion people. We must take action to reverse this dependency of Africa on others, whether it is for our own food security or indeed our public health. If we take a country like Zimbabwe, that has about 200 million metric tons of excess grains per year, or Ethiopia, or Uganda, that produce wheat, why do we have a food insecurity crisis when there are countries in Africa that have the capacity to feed the continent? It is because of the trade rules that existed and the trade patterns that existed for decades and decades. So the AfCFTA, the fundamental objective of the AfCFTA is to eliminate these barriers to intra-Africa trade, to ensure that the AfCFTA presents us with a platform or an instrument, in the case of food insecurity, for Africa to respond to her own needs, so that when there's a war somewhere in Europe that has got nothing to do with us as Africans, that we are still able to continue to feed ourselves. So we are introducing a legal instrument, which the heads of states will consider, for accelerating the elimination of tariff barriers to basic agricultural trade in Africa. Africa imports close to $40 billion a year of maize, rice, soya, and other grains. And as I've mentioned, we have a tool in the AfCFTA to combat this situation that we find ourselves in. The second point, which again underscores the importance of the AfCFTA and accelerating diversification of Africa's economy, is the public health pandemic, which correctly the Deputy Governor characterized as having transformed itself into an economic crisis. In March 2020, 42 countries in Africa were either in a partial or a full lockdown. The tourism industry suffered. The services sector in general suffered. Exports to other parts of the world were reduced by over 40%. From a public health point of view, as we all know, you and I as Africans were at the back of the queue for vaccines. A man in China donated 7 million masks in April 2020, as well as other germ-killing products to fight the pandemic. Because at that time, we did not have the productive capacity to produce the germ-killing products or the vaccines that are required. That should have been obviated by the fact that the year before, in 2019, Africa imported $19 billion worth of pharmaceutical. 2019, Africa imported $16 billion worth of pharmaceutical products that we imported from other parts of the world. Here again, the point of over-reliance on others is emphasized by this staggering number of imports for Africa's public health. Means that $16 billion worth of job creation is forgone, $16 billion worth of competitiveness is forgone. I mention this because, once again, I want to underscore the importance of this seminar, not just for the oil sector, the importance of value addition in Africa. In 2014, we saw a study by KPMG. In that study, they told us that Africa exports unprocessed coffee at that time, $6 billion. The global coffee industry at that time was estimated by that study to have been $100 billion. So you can see the losses for the African continent along the value chain as a result of the deficit that I pointed to earlier. So we have to see the AfCFTA as beyond just a trade agreement. We have to see it as an enabler for Africa's productive capacity, because where we have an integrated market of 1.4 billion people, which, as we all know, by the year 2050, by the turn of the century, 1 in 4 working people in the world will be African, with an estimated, at that time, combined GDP of 16.2 trillion United States dollars. If we do not consider ourselves to be an integrated market that has productive capacity, either to feed ourselves, to produce the medicines that we need for our own public health, I'm afraid we shall continue to be at the periphery of the global economy. So we have a very unique opportunity as Africans to reach these projections that the World Bank made, some of them the Group MD showed to us in his presentation. Lifting 50 million Africans out of abject poverty by the year 2035. Contributing over $450 billion to Africa's combined GDP based purely on trade. These are the projections. But we will not reach these projections if we consider ourselves to be Kenya, to be Malawi, to be Egypt, to be South Africa. We have to leverage on the size, the complementarities of Africa's economy and implement the AfCFTA to eliminate the barriers that have existed over the last 60 years. So where are we on implementation? Is there trade happening? Or is this a big diplomatic exercise where we meet in Addis Ababa, we drink coffee, and then we go back to our countries? This is a very valid and legitimate question, which I have been asked many times. Incidentally, I was asked, program director reminded me, I was asked this question in April 2020. I was asked this question by a journalist, and he said to me, the heads of states have said that you are trading. I am so-and-so from the Financial Times or Economist, I don't remember one of them. I want to see the numbers. Prove to me that you as Africans are trading. So I said, first of all, I'm not accountable to you. I'm accountable to Africans. And second, I encourage you to be intellectually honest. Where was the European Union in 1952? Was the European Union trading in 1952, immediately after the war, when it was established at that time as a European coal and steel pact, 5-6 European countries? So to ask me in April 2020, are we trading or not, especially when you are not African, is entirely unacceptable. But I accept that question from you because I report to you. And so let me try to answer the question. Are we implementing this agreement? First, rules of origin. We have agreed on over 90% of products traded in Africa. Think about it this way. Before the AfCFTA, the product that you produce, depending on where you were exporting to in Africa, was subject to different rules of origin, adding cost to trade and adding cost to your business. Global manufacturers of automobiles were saying, we are not interested in this market because you keep saying you have potential. But we don't see, because my company is in Kenya. If I want to export to Nigeria or any ECOWAS country, I'm subject to different rules of origin. So this has always been one of the constraints. We now have over 90% convergence on rules of origin. That means that as an economic operator, you can export to any country, any of the 47 countries of the AfCFTA who've ratified the agreement, you can export to them on the same rule of origin. And you can look at what we call a tariff book for certainty, predictability of the tariff that is applicable to what you export. And you can see whether it is Namibia or Morocco, you will know that that same percentage of a tariff applies consistently until we reach zero over a 10-year period. It was mentioned also that we introduced the Guided Trade Initiative. The agreement was drafted by lawyers and economists and politicians. And there are some part of it that make no legal sense, no economic sense, but eminent political sense. And that is because of the nature of trade agreements and trade negotiations. However, we have introduced a dispute settlement mechanism. For the very first time in Africa, we now have a forum for resolving our trade, investment, commercial disputes, adjudicated by a panel of experts, who will be African, of course. This is a very strong signal to our business community, to our investors, that we want to be subject to the rule of trade law, and that we want trade law to provide confidence to our investors as they invest across the continent. So the operationalization of the dispute settlement mechanism is a very important achievement for Africa's economy. We have also recently concluded protocols on investment protection, on competition policy, and intellectual property rights. And these protocols are important because they are the foundation of a common market. They are the foundation of what will enable the African continent to be competitive. I mentioned earlier intellectual property rights in the context of vaccine production. If you imagine for a second that for over 20 years, in another fora of the world, as Africa, we had been trying to get recognition of the fact that we must suspend patents, we must suspend intellectual property rights when we are confronted with a pandemic and when the priority must be to save lives. So now we have an intellectual property rights protocol which not only will become a framework for the protection of public health in Africa, but it will also ensure that we have innovation and production of vaccines in Africa. I want to give you an example. In 2022, last June, I was invited by President Kagame, President Akufo-Addo, President of South Africa, and the President of Senegal, President Macky Sall. These four countries established the very first of its kind mRNA vaccine production manufacturing capacity, which will spread on a continental value chain between South Africa, Rwanda, Ghana, and Senegal, producing much needed vaccines, not only for the pandemic, but also for other pandemics that we will see. That is enabled by the Protocol on Intellectual Property Rights, which we have just concluded. We have two more protocols to negotiate and to conclude: the Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade, as well as the Protocol on Digital Trade, because as was mentioned, we know that the services sector, particularly electronic commerce, digital commerce, is a critical driver of Africa's industrialization. So we want to be forward-looking in terms of digital industrialization and position our continent once again for global competitiveness. Because we know that here in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Kigali, that there are young Africans who are at the cutting edge of digital technology innovation. So we have to provide a legal framework for them to access new markets in Africa and for them to be part of the global digital economy. And so the Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade, as well as the Protocol on Digital Trade, will be concluded before the end of this year. That is, by way of examples on implementation, what we are doing. We have identified a number of priority sectors, which we believe, and our studies indicate, that these priority sectors will enable the diversification that we all want to see. I mentioned the pharmaceutical sector, agriculture and agro-processing, transport and logistics, and the auto sector. In the auto sector, again, we have an opportunity to accelerate diversification of Africa's economy. Our continent produces 900,000 units of passenger vehicles per year between South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco. We are 17% of the global population. India, similarly populated to the African continent, produces 5 million units of vehicles per year. By the year 2035, our estimates indicate that in order for us to meet domestic demand in Africa, we have to produce 5 million units of vehicles a year. That means that for Nigeria, there is an opportunity to include the auto sector in your strategy, if it's not there already, your strategy for diversification, for production of vehicles, creating jobs, driving industrialization. Because we know that the demand for the auto sector, for Africa's auto sector, is not going to be met by Egypt, Morocco, South Africa. We have to have more countries that are producing vehicles for the African continent and creating jobs and innovation and driving industrialization. I saw in the MD's presentation that part of your outcomes are included in the national economic policy formulation of Nigeria. And so I would suggest and recommend that the auto sector be closely looked at. Because we know that from every unit of investment on the assembly line to produce a vehicle, there are 4 jobs that are created in the components manufacturing sector, whether it is lithium battery manufacturing, any other kind of a component. So as we talk about diversification, value addition, let us consider the auto sector as one of the enablers for the diversification that we all want to see. And I'm very happy that our development finance institutions have stepped up. AfCFTA Bank has provided a facility of $1 billion for any country that wishes to start producing components for vehicles, for trade under the AfCFTA rules. The cost of trade in Africa and the cost of currency convertibility is very high. We estimate that $5 billion is the cost of converting to a third currency, usually the dollar or the euro, if you want to trade in Africa. As President Ruto said the other day, what has the dollar got to do with Kenya trading with Djibouti? Why is it that we're using a third currency for intra-Africa trade with the cost that is prohibitive and that constrains the competitiveness of our small medium enterprises? So that is why with AfCFTA Bank and the African Union Commission, we have introduced the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System to make sure that we now trade in local currency. So that if you are in Nigeria, your counterparty is in Zambia, you trade in Nigerian naira, your counterparty receives the Zambian kwacha, or the Kenyan shilling, or the Ugandan shilling. With the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, we are not only ensuring that we are reducing the cost of trade, that we are reducing uncompetitiveness, but we are also dismantling the colonial economic model that I mentioned earlier. And I don't think that, and we must be proud to say that I said it in Brussels, and one of our ambassadors there said, "You are telling the Europeans in Europe that you want to dismantle the colonial economic model. You are a very brave man." But we must dismantle, we must not address only the supply side constraints, we must address also the political economy constraints that have existed for decades and decades. And I'm very happy that the Nigerian interbank settlement system and the Ghana Commercial Bank, the Nigerian interbank settlement system enabled the Ghana Commercial Bank and the First Bank of Nigeria to be the first settlement, and successfully done so, under the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. So I congratulate Nigeria and Ghana for having been the very first countries to initiate the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. Lastly, on implementation, we know that there are countries that are well poised to take advantage of the AfCFTA because they have the productive capacity, the export capacity. But we want the AfCFTA to benefit all countries and all economies, big and small. And that is why we have introduced the AfCFTA Adjustment Fund, which already has been capitalized by over $1 billion. And the Adjustment Fund is intended to assist those countries that today may not have the productive capacity to invest in the machinery that is required and in any other productive function that is required for them to take advantage of the AfCFTA. Let me draw to a close, ladies and gentlemen. I know that there are going to be challenges and that this is going to be extremely difficult. Some countries will experience a balance of payments effect. There will be a coup d'etat by some man who wakes up in a military barracks and decides he wants to be the president without being elected by the people. There will be pockets of instability. There will be external shocks to our continental economic system. All of these challenges shall be there. But if you look at the integration model, which is arguably the most successful integration model in the world, the European Union, as I reminded that journalist I referred to, it took 72 years for the European Union to be the singular most competitive integrated market in the world. So we should not expect that it is going to be easy and that it is going to be an overnight achievement. There will be significant challenges, but we cannot allow the challenges to define our resolve to succeed. Because if we do that, if we say it's too difficult, we throw our hands in the air, my view is that we will remain forever on the periphery of the global economy and relying on others for pharmaceutical production, automobile production. So we have to stay the course and confront the challenges. And so I want to encourage today Nigerian exporters, investors, manufacturers to consider the entire AfCFTA market, all of the 47 countries that have ratified the agreement, as your market, your export market, so that we use the AfCFTA to scale up our production, to enhance our competitiveness. Your products are seen in Southern Africa. Your products are seen, or services, in East Africa. take advantage of this market of 1.4 billion people. Nigeria's exports to the rest of the continent in 2020 were estimated to be $6.4 billion, or 19% of total exports. Again, that may appear to be a deficit on the face of it, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to use the AfCFTA to export beyond the ECOWAS region. So there clearly is an opportunity for Nigeria to fully harness the synergies and complementarities presented by the African market and take advantage of the scale opportunities that it presents. I mentioned the sector of the digital economy. Nigeria is a leader in Africa on e-commerce and digital innovation. Nigeria is also a net exporter of cement, over 6 million metric tons of cement, I believe, that the country is able to export. Similarly, in the services sector, 50% of gross GDP in the past decade has been derived from the services sector in Nigeria. But from an export point of view, the services sector accounts for only 9% as of 2019. Again, that means that there is an opportunity for the services sector to expand, whether it is financial services, cultural services, to expand to other parts of the African continent. So the running theme of the trade seminar, diversification, is entirely consistent with the AfCFTA and its objectives. I want to leave you with what the former president of Burkina Faso said many, many decades ago. He said we must dare to invent the future today. We must dare to invent the future today. So President Sankara's words always are with me, because what we are doing as Africans is to dare to invent our own future. And that is a very, very noble ambition. So when they tell us you won't be able to do it, it's too difficult. In my view, that is what drives us, this noble ambition of creating our own future as a continent, because, as the MD said, nobody is going to develop our continent except us as Africans. Those who come must come on our terms. But no one is going to develop our continent and ensure all of the objectives that we have in place, that they happen. The economic diversification that we want to see. So I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank AfCFTA Bank for the collaboration. I want to thank Zenith Bank for the collaboration, AFDB, all of our financial institutions that have really taken leadership and must continue to take leadership of the AfCFTA. What many of you may not be aware of, and the MD may be too modest to say it here, is that Zenith Bank was the first bank to come to me to say we want to partner with you. We went to see the chairman, and the chairman said that Zenith Bank wants to make a contribution to digitize trade in Africa. I've never been offered $1 million before. It was my first time. He said, here is $1 million. The chairman said, here is $1 million to demonstrate our commitment as a bank to digitization in Africa. And so the portal that the MD made reference to wasn't my idea. It wasn't our idea as the AfCFTA Secretariat. It was Zenith Bank that stepped up and said, this has to be done.